So, as I mentioned, I'm here to talk about diversity in the workplace. So, before we get started, I want to go ahead and define what diversity is. And in its simplest form, diversity is just the presence of difference, right? And this difference can exist in multiple forms, some of which are totally visible, like race or gender, and other forms that are a little more invisible, like socioeconomic status, disability, things like that. And then we also have some that are in between, which are sexual orientation and personality differences, some of those things that we can't really draw out automatically from just looking at something. Now, why is diversity important? Why should you care about diversity? Well, the first thing is that I think we can all agree that equality is something that's important for us to strive for in the workplace, right? And in particular, as Americans, it's important for us to pull out that at the end of the day, the organization should have some form of democracy. And what that means is representation at all levels and all fields within the organization. And so, with that, it's important to consider that we want to have equality and justice and representation for all different minority groups. And so with that, we have also some financial obligations. And so if you weren't really convinced with some moral obligations, if you weren't really convinced in terms of social justice and wanting equality for different groups, I'll also convince you through some financial incentives and financial motives to why diversity is important. And so first thing I want to point out some research that shows that social category diversity and cultural diversity has resulted in different, unique, and more alternatives to different problems. So there's more creative solutions and better problem solving, as well as better criteria to evaluate such alternatives that these groups create. On top of that, there's also been shown that there's increased morale within the groups, and at the end of the day, what's most important is task performance, and these groups tend to perform better on cognitively and creatively demanding tasks, some of which are becoming more and more common in the workplace. Now, the other thing in terms of financial obligations is that not only at the group level is diversity important and shown to have some financial increases for the organization, but diversity in executive boards has also shown some positive increases in firm innovation, firm reputation, and multiple indicators of financial success for a firm. So overall, we should be morally obligated to care about social justice and diversity. And we also have this financial obligation, because at the end of the day, there are a lot of positive benefits that can come from focusing on diversity and highlighting it within our organizations. And lastly, if you weren't convinced by the moral aspect, if you weren't convinced by the financial incentives, there's also just the idea that diversity is inevitable. It's something that's coming, it's something that's currently happening. And so what studies have shown in economics and organizations is that racial and ethnic minority groups are now taking positions across different fields at all different levels. We also have women, like yourselves, occupying male-dominated positions like leadership, and also male-dominated fields like STEM, and some of those hard sciences as well. We also have people with disabilities that are taking advantage of technological advances that will now allow them to attain a broader base of occupations to work in. And then lastly, we also have LGBT people, right? Lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender folks are now coming out to their coworkers, supervisors, a lot more frequently now because the climate is a lot more accepting. And so there's a lot of different changes happening in the organization. There's a lot of dynamicity with the work groups that we're engaging. But one particular one that is most current is millennials, right? And so I speak for, I guess, I'll represent all the millennials. But in reality, we are perhaps the most educated group that's coming into the workforce. And we can argue that for a bit, and that's fine. But what I can say for certain is that we are one of the most socially aware groups. And so with that social awareness, we're going to be a lot more privy to any diversity issues in the workplace. We're going to be a lot more sensitive to them, and a lot more likely to call out any situations where we feel injustices happen. So, for all those reasons, it's important because the people in our organizations are showing us that diversity is going to be an issue that we have to deal with. But on a global level, we can also see that the economy is also globalizing. And what that means is that the employees that we're working with are going to have to traverse cultural gaps that we never really had to before. In the United States, we just deal with companies in the United States, but now we have companies that have branches in America from Japan. We have our companies in America that have branches in India. And so we're having to ensure that our employees are really understanding how to deal with different cultural groups. Now, how do you manage diversity, right? So what do we do with all this? What does this all mean? How do I leverage diversity to give me as much of the benefits as possible? Now, one of the ways is through education. And so with education, I think an important piece to consider is that diversity isn't just including more people and having more people represented. It's not just filling quotas, right? Diversity and the success of a diversity policy or a diversity program is really contingent upon how people are interacting on small, day-to-day basis, right? And that success of the interaction is really as a result of education and making sure people are understanding the cultural gaps between the different groups that are in the workforce. And so, one of the ways we can talk about education is through microaggressions. And so, this will be kind of our one little touch of education here, but there are obviously a lot more topics that we can get educated on. But in particular, microaggressions are one of the more modern forms of discrimination. And so if we look at the definition, microaggressions are statements that intentionally or unintentionally affirm stereotypes or subtly demean minority group members. Now, an important part about microaggressions, and I know I haven't shown you some examples, but we'll go through them in a bit. One thing I want to point out before I show them to you is that these microaggressions aren't so obvious as derogations or any racial, ethnic, sexual slurs, right? They're not so obvious. They're a little more subtle. And that's, I think, the insidious part about microaggressions. The negative psychological impact that it has for employees, and not just employees, but people in general, are long-term and are a result of the ambiguity behind these messages and the frequency at which these messages are being received. And so I personally can tell you that I've experienced microaggressions on nearly a daily basis for multiple minority groups that I am a part of. But what I really want to focus on is the ambiguity behind these messages. Now, because they're not so obviously discriminatory, the ambiguity leaves the victim kind of with one of two options. One of them is to call out the microaggressor and say, hey, you know, I didn't really like the way you said that, or I didn't like the message that was really behind what you said. But one of the results that could happen because of that is that the microaggressor doesn't even admit to it. They say, oh, well, you know, stop being so sensitive, you're the PC police, like, wow, lighten up, it was just a joke. And I'm sure all of us have heard that at some point, where we call out somebody, maybe even a friend, and they think that we're taking it too seriously, right? So, we don't really get to address any of those issues if we call it out. But then on the other hand, we can also stay silent. But being silent, what that really ultimately means is that we're accepting this injustice. Right? By not calling it out, we're basically saying that it's okay, it's acceptable, and if you allow it to become the norm. So, one thing to consider though is with microaggressions, staying silent isn't really an option. So what's important is to educate ourselves about microaggressions that we can actually transgress onto somebody else. And so here I'm going to go through a couple of examples of microaggressions that I personally experienced. One of them. You speak English so well. How is that? How is that feeling? Wow, yes, that's wonderful. Not a compliment. Are you almost done with your bachelor's? And I'll give you some context behind this one. So the first two were actually, I was receiving them from a colleague in my lab. His parent was coming, and I kind of, you know, not to be totally stereotypical, but he's from Middle America, a white boy, and I was like, his mom's coming. And I'm like, let me just prepare, because I've reached the point where I'm not going to assume that they're going to say anything, but I just want to prepare for the worst in case, you know, they say something that's a little ignorant, and I can, you know, take it and just let it slide off of me, right? So I did prepare, and the first two were actually things that she said, right? And so, wow, you speak English so well after I told her that I was born in Peru. When really, I was born in Peru, but I came when I was 2 months, so I've been here 26 years old. The next one, are you almost done with your bachelor's? Now, what's interesting about this one is that her son was going for a PhD, and I'm in the same lab that he's in, but for whatever reason, she didn't assume that I was getting a graduate degree. And so the only thing that I consider is that it was because of my skin color, right? That I'm brown, right? And so what that really tells me is that maybe you're not as educated, or I don't expect you to be as educated as my son is. And even though I'm in the same program and I'm also further along than he is. Next, yeah, but you're not like gay. This one, I think, sadly, I experienced way too often, and mostly from my straight friends, especially the guys. And so, being gay, what does that even mean? What is that, like, I don't even understand that. Isn't my sexuality just based on who I like? right? Isn't that what really qualifies me to be gay? Does it mean that I have to act a certain way? Does it mean that I have to look a certain way? Like, what does that really mean? And honestly, I made it a resolution of mine for 2017 to be gay enough that I never hear that say. Next is nice to meet you, Renzo. As I was introduced, my name is Renzo. That's my name, that's how I identify, and I would like for people to call me by my right name. But sadly, ever since elementary school, and I think all the way up until recently, when I've become a little more, I guess, how millennials call it, woke, being a little more awake and alive and kind of open, keeping my eyes open to all these issues, the more I realized that actually is a form of disrespect. Ever since elementary school, my teachers have pretty much either called me Lorenzo, or, especially if it's a substitute, it's whatever comes to their mind, however they read my name. And as a kid, it's as an adult, it may seem like, oh, it's a little trivial and whatever, people may not know your name, but to spend your childhood having your name mispronounced, even though it's 2 syllables and 5 letters long, was challenging, to say the least. And next, man up. So this one I wanted to add, I was like, what's a gender one that I can include, right? If I'm on the Women's Leadership Network, I should include one in gender. And so even though it's not necessarily directed towards women, it's directed to me, and what that tells me is that men are the ones who are strong. Men are the ones who are brave, men are the ones who are courageous. And overall, it means that women are not any of those things. And as I think most of us can agree, that statement is absolutely false.